Shedeur Sanders took every snap behind a line that couldn't hold, running plays that rarely gave him a chance. Yet somehow, the interceptions he threw had become the talking point, fueled by vague and deflective comments from Jeudy. It's the classic quarterback blame game. But this time, the spotlight misses the bigger picture. The offensive design was broken. The weather was brutal.
If you're into the real story and all the messy twists they don't show on highlight reels, go ahead and subscribe. And if you're sticking around to see how this Browns QB chaos plays out, you should definitely be subscribed.
The timeouts were wasted. Jeudy's narrative makes it easy to pin on the passer, but the truth paints a much broader failure. Blaming Sanders might be convenient, but it's also deeply misleading. The video pulls back the curtain on how this offense was sabotaged long before the ball was snapped. With poor coaching decisions, injury mismanagement, and a culture that seems more interested in optics than solutions, Sanders didn't stand a chance. What unfolds here is more than just a critique. It's a demand for Colorado to own its failures and stop turning quarterbacks into scapegoats. Jeudy's comments weren't just vague. They were deflective. When asked directly about the interceptions thrown by Shedeur Sanders, he responded like someone trying to walk a tightrope between honesty and brand maintenance. He focused on the plays themselves, not the circumstances. He described routes. He mentioned what needed to happen. But what he didn't say was louder than anything he actually did. He didn't once acknowledge the deeper issues. The offensive line collapsing. The play calls that made no sense in the rain. The fact that Sanders was scrambling for his life on half those throws. None of it. And it would have been one thing if Jeudy had offered constructive criticism. But instead, it felt like he was subtly shifting blame, as if Sanders was the problem. As if those interceptions came out of nowhere with no context, when, in reality, the context is screaming. Shedeur Sanders took heat from all angles. Fans online were brutal. Pundits started asking me, is he overrated? Questions. But what's wild is that most of the people criticizing him didn't seem to understand what actually went down on that field. He wasn't just throwing bad passes. He was playing behind a broken offensive line. The pocket collapsed almost instantly on most downs. The play calls? Repetitive and predictable. And let's not forget the rain, a literal downpour that made even routine plays risky. In his own press appearances, Sanders didn't point fingers. He didn't throw teammates or coaches under the bus. He owned what he could, talk about things to improve, and move forward. That's more maturity than a lot of people calling him out. On film, it's clear how stacked the odds were. Defensive linemen were blowing to the front like it was made of tissue paper. Receivers weren't getting separation, and when they did, the routes were either late developing or flat out broken. It wasn't just bad luck. It was a bad system, one that didn't adjust, one that seemed to hang Sanders out to dry. The result? Interceptions that looked like poor judgment, but were often desperation plays. You can't make reads when you've got 2 seconds before being flattened. And blaming the quarterback in that situation isn't just lazy. It's Coach Prime, to his credit, didn't feed the blame machine. His focus was growth. He talked about lessons. He talked about adjustments. He acknowledged the issues, play calling, protection, game management. And he didn't scapegoat. That kind of leadership matters. Because when the narrative around your team is spiraling, what you say becomes everything. And his approach stood in sharp contrast to what Jeudy offered. Where Jeudy deflected, Coach Prime directed. Where Jeudy distanced himself, Prime stood by his players. That difference in attitude says a lot about how each person processes adversity. Match. And speaking of adversity, let's talk about how this offense has looked in broader context. Games like the recent Browns versus Raiders showdown. A team can only go so far when the system itself is flawed. Missed blocks. Confusing audibles. No real identity. It's not just about the guy under center. It's about the chaos around him. That game showed how poor planning shows up on the field. They burned timeouts early. They challenged the wrong plays. They didn't adjust until it was too late. That's not a quarterback problem. That's a coaching and preparation. But when Jeudy speaks, those layers disappear. He talks like the only thing that matters is the route or the throw, not the 5 seconds before it or the week of prep behind it. It flattens the reality of the game into a soundbite, and that's where the harm starts. Because once that narrative takes hold, that Sanders is turnover-prone or reckless, it spreads fast, especially when it's coming from a veteran, someone who should know better, someone who should understand that football is never that simple. But maybe protecting his image mattered more in that moment than defending the truth. 2. Prime knew what was happening. You could see it in his demeanor. He knew that the headlines were circling, that the mistakes were being pinned on one kid, and that if he didn't step up and redirect the story, no one else would. So he did, not by sugarcoating, but by reframing. He spoke to the larger picture, the team's readiness, the staff's responsibility, the developmental stage they're all in, because that's the thing most people forget. Sanders isn't an NFL vet. He's still growing, still learning. And throwing him under the bus because the system failed is how you kill potential before it can thrive. Look at the plays where Sanders got up slow, where he limped off after another blindside hit. Look at the frustration in his body language, not at teammates, but at the situation. He knew the offense wasn't working. He knew the timing was off. But he also knew he had to keep going. That's the kind of pressure that doesn't show up in box scores. And it's exactly why pointing fingers without understanding the full context does more damage than people realize. Because when a player is physically and mentally exhausted, hearing that it was just a bad decision isn't helpful. It's harmful. 2. And still, Jeudy doubled down. More vague language. More avoidance. He never directly addressed the systemic issues. Never pointed to the coaching staff. Never brought up protection failures or play design. Instead, it was just the play, as if that existed in a vacuum. And that's the real issue here. Not that Jeudy had a critique, but that he had an opportunity to stand up and support a younger player and chose not to, whether it was calculated or careless. It sent a message that saving face matters more than team culture. In game after game, we've seen the same pattern repeat. Breakdown in protection, missed assignments, poor play calls, and Sanders doing everything he can to make something out of nothing. Sometimes it works. Sometimes it doesn't. But it's never because he isn't trying. It's because the structure around him is failing. That's why the blame game needs to stop. Because scapegoating a quarterback, especially a young one, for systemic dysfunction only ensures one thing, that the dysfunction continues. Growth requires accountability, not deflection. And until everyone in the building, from players to coaches, owns that nothing's 3, the thing is, Coach Prime doesn't hide from the mess. He doesn't pretend everything's fine when it isn't. In his post-game reflections, he's honest, sometimes brutally. He talks about what they didn't do well. He names the coaching decisions that missed the mark. But what he doesn't do is put it all on one person. That's leadership. That's culture setting. He's building a team, not feeding a narrative. And in this case, the narrative building around Sanders was loud, messy, and dangerously convenient. It's easier to say the quarterback cost you the game than admit the structure of your program is cracked. After the game, Sanders didn't look for pity. He didn't throw tantrums. He stood up, gave credit where it was due, took responsibility where it made sense, and moved on. That kind of poise is rare, especially for someone in his position, under this much scrutiny. He didn't deflect, but he didn't lie either. He didn't claim things were better than they were, but he also didn't pretend he was powerless. He gave a clear picture of what they faced: pressure, miscommunication, and the need to regroup. It was transparent, and that kind of honesty should have been the tone for everyone. When Shedeur speaks, it's measured. He doesn't throw buzzwords or cliche excuses. He's calm, but you can feel the weight. The weight of being the guy everyone looks to, whether it's to save the game or to blame for the loss. And that's not an easy thing to carry, especially when the infrastructure around you isn't holding up. But that's where Jeudy's comments cut deeper. Not just because of what was said, but because of what was missing. There was no solidarity, no context, just a passive wash of words that left Sanders standing alone under the floor. Prime saw that happening, and you could tell it didn't sit right. In his follow-up media sessions, he made sure to redirect, not in a fake, overprotective way, but in a way that reminded everyone watching that football is a team sport. A team loses together. A team wins together. And if your quarterback is under fire for things beyond his control, that's a failure in leadership, plain and simple. He reminded reporters of the penalties, the blown protections, the bad reads on the sidelines, things no quarterback, no matter how talented, can overcome alone, because no one is winning a game dodging blitzes behind a Swiss cheese line and a playbook stuck on repeat. 3. But Jeudy kept the focus narrow. We gotta execute better, he said. We just didn't make the plays. Vague. Sterile. The kind of answer that tells you everything and nothing. And again, nothing about the blocking breakdowns. Nothing about whether rhythm or scheme. Just enough to sound professional. Not enough to be real. And that's the problem. These comments, intentional or not, create the illusion that it was all on the quarterback, that he just didn't deliver. It erases the reality of what really happened on the field. And that illusion is what sticks with fans, with analysts, with the narrative machine. You could see the effort Shedeur was putting in. First to arrive, last to leave. Working on timing with receivers. Breaking down film. He wasn't just going through the motions. He was investing in the process. Which makes it even more frustrating when the system around him folds. And he gets painted as the problem anyway. And that's what hurts the most in situations like this. When you're doing the work, showing up every day, and still get put on the wrong side of the story because someone else didn't want to take the hit. That's not just unfair, it's damaging. To trust, to team chemistry, to. In the actual plays, you can see it all unravel. There's one shot where Sanders drops back, and by the time his plant foot hits, there's a defender already in his face. That's not a quarterback mistake. That's a protection failure. There are clips of receivers running routes that take way too long to develop, while Sanders has to improvise with less than 3 seconds. That's not bad decision-making. That's bad design. And yet, every time someone like Jeudy skips over all of that in a soundbite, the burden doubles. Because now Sanders isn't just trying to win games. He's trying to fight the perception that he's the reason they're losing. When they played the 49ers, the same pattern showed up. Game plan rigidity. No adjustment to pressure packages. No rhythm in the passing game. And again, the quarterback absorbing all of it. Meanwhile, coaching challenges came late. Timeout management was chaotic. The sideline looked unprepared. But post-game, most of the talk was still about the interceptions. As if those were the only things that mattered. That's the culture problem. It's not about learning. It's about blame. And it didn't stop. In the Vikings matchup, Sanders was once again under siege. The line couldn't hold for more than a heartbeat. The play-action calls made no sense given the defensive fronts. And still, he pushed. He made plays on the move. He tried to carry the offense. But there's only so much you can do when your coaching decisions are actively making it harder. It's the same cycle every week. And the longer it goes unacknowledged by teammates, the worse it gets, not just for the team, but for the player's growth. Because you can't develop in an environment built on selective accountability. Yet, Jeudy kept playing the media game. It's football, he shrugged. Things happen. No ownership. No acknowledgement of the breakdowns around him. Not even a hint of support for the quarterback taking the brunt of the fallout. Just neutrality dressed up as professionalism. And maybe he thinks that's smart. Maybe he thinks keeping things vague protects him. But what it really does is highlight the gap between real leadership and self-preservation. Because being a leader isn't about dodging blame. It's about standing with your team when things go sideways. Match. When they faced the Dolphins, it felt like deja vu. Once again, the offense couldn't find a rhythm. The first few drives were stalled by penalties, false starts, holding mental mistakes. And yet Sanders kept pushing. He scrambled, improvised, and kept looking for something to spark the team. But every drive was like dragging a boulder uphill. And when the interceptions came, they were treated like unforced errors instead of symptoms of a broken system. The Dolphins' defense capitalized on every crack in the structure. Blitzes went unpicked. Routes got jammed. And Sanders had to operate in that chaos, while everyone else got a pass. There was no hiding the fact that he was being set up to fail. And no one from within the team Not Jeudy, not the coaches, bothered to say otherwise. Interview. After the game, Coach Prime was asked directly about the loss in Sanders' interceptions, and his answer was what you'd expect from someone who gets it. He didn't deny the mistakes, but he explained them. He brought up the pressure. He mentioned the misassignments. He pointed to the full picture. And most importantly, he stood by his quarterback, because that's what real leaders do. They don't change their tone based on the scoreboard. They stay consistent, especially when the noise is at its loudest. Prime's response wasn't a PR move. It was a statement of principle. If the system fails, the blame doesn't fall on one guy. Two, there was a moment in that game where Sanders got hit hard and stayed down a second longer than usual. Trainers came out. He waved them off, got up, but you could tell it was taking a toll. And it wasn't just physical. It was the emotional weight of knowing that even when you're the one absorbing all the hits, you're still going to be the one people blame. He sat on the bench, helmet off, staring down. The camera zoomed in, hungry for that image of disappointment. But what they caught was exhaustion. And what made it worse was that when teammates like Jeudy had the mic, they didn't use it to defend him. They used it to distance. The team's performance overall was sloppy. Poor clock management again. Wasted timeouts. Challenges that made no sense. Every opportunity to regain momentum was lost due to the same recurring issues. And yet, in the post-game narrative, those things took a backseat. Instead, headlines read, "Sanders throws 2 costly picks," as if that's all there was to the story. That's how a culture of scapegoating is built, not by direct attacks, but by what gets left out, by who's silent, by who gets away with vague answers while one person gets dragged. When Sanders spoke to reporters, he didn't name names. He didn't mention protection issues or the weather or the play calling, but it was clear he wanted to. You could hear in his tone, measured, careful, frustrated. He talked about getting better, about staying together as a unit. He gave credit to the defense. He thanked his coaches. He kept it professional. But beneath the polish was a player who knew he was being asked to carry the weight of a failing system. And still, he took the high road again. 5. And Jeudy? He got asked again about the offensive struggles. This time, he leaned even more into vagueness. We all got to do our jobs better. We just got to execute. All technically true, but still no context. Still no mention of how those breakdowns led to Sanders forcing throws just to get something going. By this point, it was clear Jeudy wasn't interested in protecting the team. He was protecting the brand. And in doing so, he left a younger player out to dry. Prime, meanwhile, kept the focus where it needed to be. In team meetings, during media scrums on the sideline, his message was consistent, that the offense needed a reset, that the coaching staff had to be better, that the preparation wasn't good enough. And he owned it. Even when the cameras were off, insiders say Prime made it clear. The problems are bigger than one guy, and that tone matters. Because when the head coach speaks like that, it gives the rest of the locker room permission to be honest too. But when a vet like Jeudy refuses to follow that lead, it sends the opposite message, that covering yourself matters more than calling it straight. Across every game this season, the patterns repeat. Pressure off the edge with no pickup. Delayed play calls that kill momentum. Receivers breaking late or giving up on routes. And Sanders, still delivering when he can. Still throwing dimes under pressure. Still taking hits and getting back up. He's not perfect. No quarterback is. But you can't evaluate him without evaluating the conditions. And you definitely can't act like those interceptions are coming out of thin air. They're coming out of desperation, out to try and make something happen when the system around you keeps... When asked about leadership, Sanders said something that stood out. You can't just talk. People got to see you show up every day. And he does. He's in the film room. He's mentoring younger players. He's asking questions. And he's not throwing tantrums when things fall apart. That's not just maturity. That's accountability. The kind that should be contagious. But when veterans act like they're above the message gets lost. And the locker room starts to fracture, too. It's ironic, isn't it? There are shots of Jeudy and Sanders together, on the field, in warm-ups, on the sideline. looking like teammates. But when the mic is in front of them, only one of them speaks like a teammate. The other speaks like someone trying to protect a brand. And in a sport that thrives on unity, that disconnect isn't just disappointing, it's dangerous. Because if the vets won't own the chaos, the younger players are left to carry more than just the ball. They carry the blame too. By the time they face the Titans, the script was starting to write itself. Early pressure, drop passes, penalties at the worst possible moments. And still, Sanders came out firing. He made throws that had no business being completed, extended plays with his legs, and tried to inject life into an offense that looked creatively bankrupt. But once again, the numbers at the end of the night didn't tell the story. They just pointed fingers. He threw another interception, one that came after 3 straight missed blocks and a tip route. Context? Didn't matter. The headlines wrote themselves, and the blame went to the quarterback. And once again, Jeudy had nothing of substance to say, just recycled comments, empty of any support or five. Coach Prime, however, kept the same energy. In front of the cameras, he said what needed to be said, that blaming Sanders ignores the bigger picture, that this team's problems are layered, from coaching to preparation to leadership. He called for accountability at every level, not just under center. And that's where this whole story lands. It's not about protecting one player. It's about telling the truth. It's about refusing to fall for the easy scapegoat when a real issue is a system that's failing its talent. Because until that changes, until vets start showing up with honesty, until the coaching staff owns their role, this cycle of blame is going to keep spinning. If you've been watching this mess unfold, drop your take in the comments. Who do you think should be held accountable? Tap that like button if you're tired of the blame game. And if you want more breakdowns that cut through the noise, hit subscribe and stick around, because we're just getting started.